Peter never paid much attention to his sister's boyfriends. They came and went like the tide, some lasting longer than others, but none leaving a lasting impression. Lily had a way of diving headfirst into romance, convinced each time that she had found the one. Peter had learned not to get attached. He'd been through too many of her heartbreaks, too many nights spent wiping away her tears after another failed relationship. So when she called, her voice buzzing with excitement, insisting that he meet her new boyfriend Zack, Peter barely reacted. Just another guy, he thought, another name that would fade into irrelevance. Still, family was family, and Lily was relentless when she wanted something. So there he was, standing in her warm, candle-lit apartment, a beer in hand, waiting for the inevitable introduction. And then the door opened. Zack walked in like he owned the room, exuding a quiet confidence that made Peter's stomach twist unexpectedly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes and an easy, lopsided grin, he wasn't what Peter expected. And when Zack's gaze locked onto his, something unfamiliar flickered in the air between them. It was unsettling, it was dangerous, and worst of all, it was intriguing. At first, Peter told himself that his unease around Zack was just skepticism, just the usual wariness of a protective brother sizing up his sister's new boyfriend. But as dinner went on, that excuse started to crumble. Zack wasn't like the others. He wasn't the overeager type who tried too hard to impress or the indifferent one who barely acknowledged Peter's existence. No, Zack was different. He was sharp but effortless, confident but not cocky. He carried himself with a kind of ease that made Peter uncomfortably aware of his own presence. Lily led most of the conversation, bubbling with excitement as she recounted how she and Zack met, how perfect he was, how she had never felt this way about anyone before. Peter half listened, stealing occasional glances at Zack, trying to pinpoint what it was that unsettled him. But every time he looked, Zack was already watching him. There was nothing obvious about it, no lingering stares, no knowing smirks, just a quiet intensity, a subtle awareness that made Peter feel like he was being studied just as much as he was. Then, as Lily laughed at something Peter barely registered, Zack caught his gaze across the table. This time, he didn't look away. His lips curved into the faintest smirk, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Peter's breath hitched. He was the first to break the stare, his pulse hammering in his throat. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. It started subtly, small moments that could be brushed off as nothing. A joke that lingered between them a second too long. An exchange of glances that held something unspoken. At first, Peter told himself he was imagining it. Zack was just being friendly, and Peter was overanalyzing everything. But then came the texts. At first, they were harmless, a casual "hey, saw this and thought of you," accompanied by a movie recommendation or a meme. Then, they grew more personal. "Lily said you had a rough day. You good?" It was strange, the way Zack seemed to notice things. The way he seemed to read Peter in a way most people didn't. And Peter found himself responding faster than he should, finding excuses to keep the conversation going. Lily, oblivious, encouraged it. She loved that Zack and Peter got along. "You should go out for drinks together," she'd say, grinning. "Bond, you two are like family now." The words made Peter's stomach twist. And then one night, it happened. Peter had been at a coffee shop, working, when Zack appeared, sliding into the seat across from him like they had planned it. "Look at you, being all productive," Zack teased, nudging Peter's laptop. Peter smirked, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened. "Didn't peg you for the just show up uninvited type." Zack leaned back, unbothered. "I'll take that as an invitation to stay." And he did, and for the first time, Peter didn't want him to leave. The night had a pulse of its own, a slow, deliberate rhythm that Peter couldn't escape. He should have gone home, should have excused himself before things became too complicated. But he didn't. Instead, he sat in the dimly lit bar across from Zack, swirling the last remnants of his drink, watching the way the amber liquid caught the light. Zack looked different tonight, more subdued. His usual sharp smirk softened at the edges. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And Peter noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened around his glass. "Tough day?" Peter asked, voice low. Zack let out a humorless chuckle. You could say that. He hesitated, then shook his head. Work was hell. And Lily. His words trailed off, unfinished, as he downed the rest of his drink in one go. Peter felt something tighten in his chest. What about Lily? Zack's jaw tensed, and for the first time, he didn't meet Peter's gaze. It's nothing, but it wasn't nothing. Peter knew that. The silence between them thickened, heavy with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Outside, the city hummed with life. But in here, it was just the two of them, lost in something that had no name. Peter should have ended the night right there. But when Zack nudged his knee against his under the table, a flicker of heat surged through him. And he knew, he wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Peter told himself it was harmless. A little too much to drink. A conversation that lingered too long. The kind of moment that would eventually fade into the background of 100 other nights. But as he and Zack walked side by side through the quiet streets, the space between them felt charged, humming with an energy Peter didn't want to name. The air was cool, the city wrapped in a hush that only came in the late hours. Zack shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his steps slower than usual, like he wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. Peter wasn't either. You ever feel like you're just going through the motions? Zack muttered, eyes fixed ahead, his voice almost lost to the wind. Peter glanced at him. What do you mean? Zack let out a sharp breath, his fingers flexing inside his jacket, like you're playing a role someone else cast you in. And if you stop, even for a second, the whole thing comes crashing down. Peter didn't answer right away. He understood that feeling too well. Instead, he reached for Zack's wrist, barely a touch. Just enough to make him stop. Zack turned to him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The city stretched around them. Indifferent, watching. Peter swallowed, his pulse hammering as Zack's gaze flickered down to his lips, then back to his eyes. And then it happened. The moment shattered, but neither of them turned away. Neither of them walked away. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy like a storm waiting to break. Peter could still taste Zack on his lips, could still feel the heat of his touch. But now that it was over, reality settled in like a cold weight in his chest. Zack sat at the edge of Peter's couch, head in his hands, his breath uneven. The air smelled of whiskey and something unspoken, something dangerous. I shouldn't have come here, Zack muttered, rubbing his fingers against his temples. Peter exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You say that, but you're still here. Zack lifted his head, eyes stormy, conflicted, and that's the problem. Peter clenched his jaw, fighting the frustration bubbling inside him. Then go. For a second, he thought Zack would. His muscles tensed like he was ready to bolt. But then, just as quickly, he sagged back against the couch, shaking his head. You know I can't. Peter swallowed the lump in his throat. He should have felt victorious. But all he felt was exhaustion. Then stop pretending this is something you regret. Zack's eyes snapped to his, burning with something raw. For a moment, it seemed like he might deny it, might push Peter away all over again. But then, instead of speaking, he reached out, hesitant, cautious, his fingers brushing against Peter's hand. Peter didn't pull away. Because, for all of Zack's guilt, for all of his hesitation, there was one undeniable truth between them. Neither of them wanted to stop. The weight of their choices was finally catching up to them. Peter sat on the floor of his apartment, legs stretched out, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. He stared at the amber liquid, but his mind was elsewhere, on Zack, on the way his hands had felt against his skin, on the fire that ignited between them and the destruction left in its wake. Zack hadn't answered his texts, hadn't called. It had been days, and Peter could feel the silence like a wound, raw and festering. He should have expected it. Zack was never one to sit in the wreckage. He ran from it, from anything that forced him to feel. But this time, Peter wasn't sure if he could let him go. The knock at the door was quiet, hesitant. Peter's pulse kicked up before he even moved. He didn't need to check, he knew it was Zack. When he opened the door, Zack stood there, looking like he hadn't slept, his eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, something heavier. I don't know what I'm doing, Zack admitted, voice hoarse. Peter exhaled, stepping aside to let him in. Yeah, well, welcome to the club. The door shut behind them, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Zack ran a hand through his hair, his walls visibly cracking. I'm tired of fighting this, he said. Peter's chest tightened. Then don't. And just like that, Zack closed the distance, and for the first time, neither of them pulled away. Peter had never known silence could be this loud. The weight of what they had done, of what they had been, pressed down on him like an iron fist as he sat across from Lily at the dimly lit cafe. She hadn't touched her coffee. Her hands, usually expressive, were still, fingers curled into tight fists against the tabletop. Her eyes, red-rimmed and brimming with something raw, locked onto his, searching for an explanation he couldn't give. How alone? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of 1,000 unspoken words. Peter swallowed hard, his throat tightening. There was no good answer. No way to soften the edges of the truth. A while. Lily let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head. A while, she echoed, her voice thick with disbelief. My boyfriend, my brother, and neither of you had the decency to stop yourselves. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't meant for it to happen. That he had tried, that they both had, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice strained. Her lips parted, and for a moment, he thought she might yell, that she might unleash the fury burning in her eyes. But instead, she exhaled, long and unsteady. I don't even know who you are anymore. And just like that, she stood, her chair scraping against the floor as she walked away, leaving Peter sitting in the wreckage of their shattered relationship, wondering if there was anything left to salvage. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Peter had lost count of how many times he reached for his phone, only to stop himself. What could he even say? Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry wouldn't erase the betrayal, wouldn't undo the wreckage he and Zack had left in their wake. But silence was unbearable too. So when Lily finally called, his breath caught. He answered on the first ring, gripping the phone as if it might slip through his fingers. Meet me, she said, no emotion, no warmth, just a quiet demand. Peter didn't hesitate. When he arrived at the park, she was already there, arms crossed, her posture stiff. The setting sun bathed her in gold, but there was nothing warm in her expression. You wanted to talk, he said carefully. Lily's jaw clenched. No, I wanted to hear you say it. Peter swallowed hard. Say what? That you love him. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He should deny it, should fight it, but looking at Lily, at the pain and exhaustion in her eyes, he knew she deserved the truth. I do, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. But I love you too, Lily, and I hate myself for what I've done to you. She exhaled, long and slow. Then hate yourself a little longer, she murmured, because I don't forgive you yet. And with that, she walked away, not slamming the door shut, but leaving it just barely open. Weeks passed, and the silence between them remained heavy, unyielding. Peter had resigned himself to the idea that Lily might never forgive him. That he had lost not just her, but Zack too. He had shattered everything, and maybe some things weren't meant to be pieced back together. But then, one evening, his phone buzzed. A simple message from Lily, come over. No explanation, no anger, just 2 words that sent his heart racing. When he arrived, she was waiting on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, eyes unreadable. I'm still angry, she said before he could speak. I probably will be for a long time. Peter nodded, the lump in his throat making it impossible to respond. But I also know that anger isn't all I feel, she continued, and I don't want it to be the only thing left between us. A tentative hope flickered in his chest. So what now? He asked softly. Lily exhaled, studying him for a long moment. Now, she said, we figure out how to live with the truth. And for the first time in months, Peter felt like maybe, just maybe, they could.